you Awakening Wonders. Thanks for joining me today for this very unique, spectacular and magnificent conversation with Lara Logan. Do you know who Lara Logan is? She was once a treasured and adored debutante, clutched to the bosom of CNN, hosting 60 Minutes, adored and devout. She's experienced some extraordinary trauma, things that sort of staggering and difficult to believe. I'm not saying I don't believe her. I do actually believe my guest. I think she's telling the absolute truth. But for someone to have such insights on independent media, on centralized media, and above all else, the potential maneuvering of occultist forces within political and secular spaces is undeniably fascinating. You can see why on X she's much adored and admired by the likes of Musk himself, and I believe this is someone that will continue to inform and change the conversation. Her 10 commandments on journalism has to be seen and heard to be believed, like all of Deuteronomy. Hey, if you're watching us on YouTube, by the way, we're only going to be with you for about the first 15 minutes or so. Why? Because we start talking about dark, weird stuff. The kind of dark, weird stuff that, in all frankness and in all honesty, they don't want us discussing on a platform that's to some degree controlled by a globalist interest. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's a bit late now because we've already been dubbed that. If you refuse to be compliant, what's the choice? You're a conspiracy theorist. Without any more nonsense, in fact, with one more bit of nonsense, if you're not a member of our Awaken Wonder community on Locals right now, then become one. Break Bread is the show that I do every single week where I have conversations with fantastic Christians, whether that's Jack Posobiec or whether it's Jonathan Peugeot, who's coming up this week. It's a brilliant conversation. Well, I don't know yet. It should be. I haven't had it yet, but I know that I'll be asking him about Christ. I'll be asking him about myth. I'll be asking him about power. Excuse me. I'll be asking him about his friendship with Jordan Peterson. All stuff that's likely to illuminate you, edify you, educate you, and elevate your consciousness to a plane that you didn't believe was possible till you became a member of our community. And to get you ready for that, here's a person that stands astride numerous worlds like a colossus, forgive the image, because she's been an expert journalist. She's a journalist with integrity and power. And as a result of that, she's experienced incredible attacks and censorship. Please welcome to Stay Free with Russell Brand, Lara Logan. Lara, thanks so much for being there.
Thank you, Russell. I'm excited to be here.
Are you?
Well, you would not believe it, but I'm actually in Dallas right now, although I live in a small country town in the middle of the Texas Hill Country. So I'm not normally in the grand metropolis. There's around 11,000 people in my town usually.
We're living in a seismic moment when it comes to the power of legacy media or mainstream media versus independent media. Lessons that appear to have become apparent in 2016, notably in the cases of the first election of Donald Trump and the Brexit vote in the UK, where the British public voted to leave the EU, demonstrated that no longer could systems of government rely on the conduit to the people being the old school media, and that would guarantee them electoral results that were favorable to them. Now, we've sort of seen it again in 2024. Prior to Trump's second election, the conversations I was having with people in this space were, do you think that since 2016, centralized authority, whether it's the censorship industrial complex or big tech platforms or governments using like groups like CRISP or Logically AI, have found ways to manage online communications that will mean that in 2024, Kamala Harris will be victorious rather than Trump? Now, obviously now we know the answer to that question. What does that tell us about how independent media and social media are likely to align going forward? And what is likely to be the impact politically? Are we going to see increasing attempts to censor, or are we going to see new political movements emerge out of social media? I'm not sure if you're familiar with that guy Phidias, who's a member of the European Parliament, who's like a social media star that got elected into the European Parliament, that just all that, okay guys, no, this is the budget, and he just tells you transparently stuff. He's like, he's been on my show. He's a fantastic young man. I just wonder what we've learned about the limits of centralized power, whether it's state or media, and what you envisage as an independent journalist yourself, having had experiences in mainstream media, having been a denizen of that world and a decorated journalist within that world. How do you feel it's going to unfold with the recent victory of Trump MAGA? What do you envisage evolving from this situation?
Well, there's a groundswell of support across social media for independent journalists and for citizen journalism, right? And if you look at that, Russell, I always try to understand what is really behind this. What is this really about? So if you look at it, we have been for some time in the stage of fifth generation warfare. You know, the generations of warfare are obvious. It started out with swords and clubs and all the rest of it. And then you introduce mechanized warfare and planes and obviously then you have, machine guns and all the rest of it come in. Then finally, fourth generation warfare was where you introduce terrorist groups, non-state actors in this kind of covert warfare. And then now you're in fifth generation warfare, which is the information battle space, where information is no longer a weapon of war. It is the entire battlefield. So what you're talking about happened in 2016 that took them by surprise, that they then worked very hard to make sure didn't happen in 2020 and then just happen again in 24, is that they had what is known as information dominance. And you could see that because every tactic that they used was successful. So when they said Trump was a white supremacist, which wasn't any more true in 2016 or 20 or 24, right? Why did it work in 2017, 18, 19, 20? And it didn't work in 2024 because they no longer had information dominance. And what was the spear? Well, Elon Musk taking over Twitter then gave up one of the most important weapons in the information battle space because it's so vast and it reaches people and it gave such a voice. But that wasn't all. I mean, as you pointed out, it was yourself, quite frankly, Joe Rogan, all these other podcasters who are able to amass huge audiences, but not just audiences, right? Because it's one thing if you're in the echo chamber. When you're on social media, the reason you keep getting the same information or similar stories or things that appeal to you and your ideology is because the algorithms are written to create what's called feedback loops. So I may think if I'm a Trump supporter, oh, Trump's doing great because in my feedback loop, everything positive about Trump. Or if I'm a Harris supporter, I'm getting the same thing in my feedback loop. But somewhere in between that is the truth. Well, how do you break that information dominance? You do it with people like Russell Brand. You do it with people like Joe Rogan. You do it with people like RFK Jr. because their audience is not the mega base. Their audience goes beyond. So what do they want? They want Lara Logan never to be heard by anyone who's libertarian or independent or open-minded. You can be a Democrat and just be open-minded. You want to know the truth about, child trafficking, which is something I cover a lot. Well, how do we keep you isolated from Lara Logan so you never hear the truth? So if this is the most simple example I can give you, if you were a Trump supporter in 2020, you saw the visible physical image that was a manifestation of his support base. So you knew when the 2020 election results happened, you knew it was a lie. You knew before it went to court. You knew before the experts got on TV and yelled at you. You knew before the Justice Department started criminalizing it. You knew it was a lie because you knew that a guy doesn't get elected from his basement when he's drawing circles around the 8 people at his rally and someone else who's churning out crowds of 30, 40, 50, 60,000 during COVID is the more popular candidate. But if you were living in that Biden world, it made perfect sense to you. You know why? You never saw a Trump crowd. You never saw a Trump rally because they stopped covering it. And not only did they do that, look at a person like Candace Owens. Candace was phenomenally successful. And in 2020, she got taken off Facebook. And not only did she get taken off Facebook, but her emails were blocked. Her text messages were blocked. Why? Because the email companies and the tech companies and the phone companies, they all got together. And in what is basically a seditious conspiracy, they agreed to block people whose voices they didn't want heard to maintain information dominance. But when Elon Musk bought Twitter, that was over. It was done. So you still have censorship. You still have people who are unhappy. But ultimately, you broke information dominance. And then what did you have? You just had a groundswell of truth, whether it was citizen journalists or it was citizen activists. You had all of these people rising up and saying, we're not going to do this anymore. And then you had people like myself. I wasn't the only one, but you had people calling out the tactics, right? So when they say that Trump is a Hitler, right? Or Trump is a Nazi, it's like, wait a minute, hold on. You have the Azov battalion in Ukraine, which is the division actually, who are real Nazis who fly the swastika, have that as their flag. You have Ukrainian soldiers walking around with the black sun of the occult on their uniforms. And who used that emblem? The Nazi SS. And by the way, where was the SS headquartered during the Second World War? Oh, yeah, Western Ukraine. Right? And then they yelled and screamed when Putin said, "I'm going into Ukraine to get rid of the Nazis." And everybody said, how could he disrespect the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian Jews who were murdered? But who murdered them? The Nazis of Ukraine, mostly, right? So they couldn't stop the truth from rising. And then what did you see? You saw it bleeding into MSNBC. I mean, this is the home of state-run propaganda in the United States. And yet you've got people on CNN and MSNBC literally saying, I'm not voting for Kamala Harris. I mean, by the way, African American voters on their air saying, I'm not voting for her because of this, 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 and this. And by the way, she's not black. Well, what does that tell you? That the tactics that they were using have now failed, right? People are not putting up with it. People are speaking up. People are pushing back. When they first tried to, put Charlottesville on Donald Trump and call him a white supremacist, what did most people do? Including Republicans, by the way. They hid. They hid like little cowards because they didn't want to be associated with that. So on the one hand, it is cowardly, but on the other hand, what's in our DNA? We are herd animals. Where do we find safety? In numbers. You go into the wild. I'm an African. I grew up in Africa. You go into the bush. Where will you find the animals? You'll find them herding together because there's safety in numbers. So on the one hand, it's part of our DNA. On the other hand, we very often lack the moral courage to stand up and take the hits. But now people have seen through 4 years of Biden and through having a voice, through the success of the Charlie Kirks of this world, the success of Tucker Carlson, the success of Russell Brand, and the voices of the Tulsi Gabbards and the RFK Juniors, people who crossed the aisle and said, wait a minute, I wasn't ever a conservative, but I'm not a lunatic. Right? I'm not, and when you have Kamala Harris standing up at a rally and she says to two young men who cry out, Jesus is Lord and Christ is King, and she says, oh, I'm sorry, you're at the wrong rally. That message would have been buried before behind a wall of information dominance. But now it's reaching. This time it reached Christians on all sides of the political spectrum. And people said, hold on a second. What is she saying? You're the party of the godless. If you follow God, you got to go to the other side of the aisle. And that's what you saw in the 2024 election. But now with the rise of citizen journalism, this is the one thing that I would say to you. And I would ask, this is probably the most important thing for me right now. I am an old school journalist in the sense that I believe in principles of journalism. And I believe that without principles, every time you create a space, these people, this darkness will fill that space. And so citizen journalism is hugely important, but it's kind of anchorless right now. They're not investing in beat journalism. They're not investing in other journalists because most citizen journalists are just struggling to survive. I know every day is a daily struggle for me to survive. And I have, every journalism award, almost every award in existence, I already have, and many of them multiple times. So I'm a known entity, and people have that sense of my history as a real journalist. But what if you're a young kid trying to make it today? You can't send a young kid down to Aurora, Colorado, which has been taken over by Tren de Aragua, one of the most violent cartels in the world, and ask them to go around the building asking people, are you a member of the cartel? And when everyone tells you no, then you say, oh, well, it's not true. There's no Tren de Aragua. There's no cartel activity in Aurora, Colorado. Well, absolutely there is. But all those people are lying to you because the moment you leave, the cartel's going to, quite frankly, murder their children in front of them and then bleed them out slowly. Right. So this, Russell, I never forget as a young journalist walking into my news editor's office or into a news editorial meeting and literally having the shit kicked out of me by all the others because I was young and idealistic and I didn't really know what real journalism was. Who's doing that? Who's mentoring and helping and supporting citizen journalists? There's nobody right now. It doesn't exist. And so we as journalists, if we are real journalists, who's going to fix it? Who's going to make sure that what rises out of the ashes of legacy media is built on a foundation of principle? I wrote the 10 commandments of real journalism. Somebody told me not to call it the 10 commandments, but I didn't listen to them because principle comes directly from who we are as we were created by the Creator. It comes from God. And so these are the 10. I mean, I can send them to you if you want. They're very basic.
For the rest of this conversation, you're going to have to click the link in the description. It's about to get fantastic. Start the countdown now. The remainder of this conversation, we get into occultism, we get into Satanism, we get into global power, we get into the manipulative endeavors of centralized media forces. And to talk about that properly, you got to be on Rumble. You got to be in that sweet stream of freedom. Join us there. Click the link right now before we disappear off YouTube, before it's too late. Get on over here with us. Tell me the 10 commandments of principled journalism, Lara Logan, because this, I believe, is the future of journalism, that it has to come from some universal principles. It can't be derived from what they call rationalism, but it's plainly the